Millionaire went to evict a tenant, but upon hearing his two children, Richard Collins slammed his hand on the steering wheel of his Lexus LS as he sat stuck in New York City's gridlocked traffic. The real estate tycoon checked his expensive wristwatch once again and took a deep breath, trying to contain his frustration. This wasn't just another routine visit to collect late rent. It was personal. Just then, his phone rang again. His secretary informed him that the foreign investors had confirmed the meeting to discuss the Magnolia Gardens project, a luxury development set to replace that row of old houses in Astoria. The problem? One tenant was refusing to leave despite being 3 months behind on rent. Richard straightened his tie and decided to settle the matter once and for all. He headed there with one goal: to make the delinquent tenant sign the eviction papers today, even if it meant using more persuasive methods. As he parked his imported car on the modest street, Richard ignored the curious glances from neighbors. The contrast was striking. His impeccable Italian suit stood out sharply against the humble surroundings. The small house with the blue door was the second to last on the block, and the "Home is where the heart is" sign hanging by the entrance made him roll his eyes. Cheap sentimentality wouldn't pay the bills, he thought. He adjusted the eviction documents in his leather briefcase and strode purposefully to the door. He knocked firmly 3 times, already rehearsing the stern words he'd use. To his surprise, it wasn't an adult who answered, but 2 small children. A boy around 7 years old, with messy brown hair and a striped shirt, protectively held the hand of a girl who looked about 5, dressed in a light blue dress with frightened eyes. Richard hesitated for a moment, caught off guard. "Can I help you, mister?" the boy asked in a voice far steadier than his age suggested. Is your father home?" Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain his imposing demeanor. "Daddy's sleeping because he worked all night to get the rent money," the boy replied, looking Richard straight in the eye. "He asked not to wake him until noon." Richard checked his watch. It was only 20 minutes to noon. The girl, who had been half hidden behind her brother, stepped forward and asked, "Are you Daddy's friend?" The innocent question made Richard's throat tighten. Without thinking, he crouched down to their level, a gesture that didn't suit him, but something in those young eyes disarmed him momentarily. "I know your father because of the house," he answered carefully. The girl smiled, revealing a missing front tooth. "I'm Lucy. I'm 5. This is my brother, Ethan. He takes care of me when Daddy's working." Ethan kept a serious expression, clearly suspicious of the well-dressed stranger at their door. In the background, Richard noticed a vase of wilted sunflowers struggling to survive. For some reason, they brought back a memory he'd tried hard to bury. The sunflowers his late wife, Olivia, used to grow in their mansion's garden. "What does your father do for work?" Richard asked, buying time as he decided what to do next. "He's a nurse," Ethan answered, still wary. "He works at 2 different hospitals. Yesterday, he came home really happy because he finally got the money for rent." An uneasy feeling settled in Richard's chest. This so-called delinquent tenant wasn't some deadbeat, as his lawyers had suggested. He was a nurse, probably overworked, raising 2 kids alone. "Do you live here with just your dad?" he asked, already guessing the answer. "Mommy became a little star when Lucy was born," said Ethan, lowering his voice. "But we have a picture of her in our room. Daddy says she watches over us from heaven." Lucy, seemingly accustomed to the absence she never knew, pulled something from her dress pocket. "Want to see my drawing? The teacher let me bring it home. It's our family." Richard took the folded paper the little girl handed him. In the crayon, drawing 3 stick figures smiled in front of a blue house. Above them, a figure with wings floated among clouds. Just then, a woman around 70 years old approached the gate. She carried a covered pot in her hands and looked curiously at Richard. "Good morning, is Michael up yet? I brought some soup for the children's lunch," said the woman, with a warmth that contrasted with Richard's formality. "Mrs. Murphy," Lucy exclaimed, running to hug the elderly woman. "He's still sleeping, Mrs. Murphy," explained Ethan. "Dad came home really tired this morning." The woman finally took a closer look at Richard, studying him from head to toe. "Are you related to Michael?" "No, I'm..." Richard hesitated, suddenly embarrassed to explain he was there to possibly evict this family. "I'm the property owner." Mrs. Murphy's face lit up. "Oh, how nice that you came in person. Now you can see for yourself that Michael's a good man. He's had a hard time since that accident at the hospital left him out of work without proper pay. But he's hard-working, honest, takes care of these children like no one else." Richard felt cornered by the woman's genuine kindness. He realized he'd arrived with a completely different image of this family. "Mrs. Murphy looks after us when Dad has to work during the day too," Ethan added, as if wanting to reassure Richard they were never alone. "And do you help your father?" Richard asked, drawn into a conversation he never imagined having when he left home that morning. "I make my bed every day," Lucy said proudly, "and I can make cheese sandwiches. I wash the dishes and clean the yard," Ethan added, with the maturity of someone carrying responsibilities beyond his years. "And I help Lucy with her homework." A door opened inside the house, and a sleepy voice called out, "Ethan? Lucy? Who are you talking to?" Michael Stevens appeared in the doorway, still wearing pajama pants and a plain white t-shirt. Dark circles under his eyes and messy hair showed he'd just woken up. When he saw Richard, his face instantly paled. "Mr. Collins," he said, immediately recognizing the property owner. Michael quickly tried to smooth his hair with his hands and straightened his posture. "Sorry about how I look. I just woke up. Worked all night." Richard stood, regaining some of his usual business-like demeanor, but something had subtly shifted in his expression. "Mr. Stevens, I came about the rent situation," he said, trying to keep his tone professional. Michael swallowed hard and turned to his children. "Ethan, take your sister inside with Mrs. Murphy, please. I need to talk to Mr. Collins." The children obeyed, though not before Lucy waved at Richard. "Bye, rent man. Come back later to see. Daddy, okay?" Mrs. Murphy gave Michael a worried look, which he answered with a slight nod. Once the children were inside, Michael gestured to Richard. "Please, would you come inside to talk?" There was dignity in his request, despite his visible discomfort. Richard nodded and stepped into the house. The interior was modest, but impeccably clean and tidy. On a simple sideboard in the living room, several photographs showed the family's happy moments. One in particular caught Richard's eye. Michael and a beautiful young woman, pregnant, smiling at the camera. Something in her expression reminded him of Olivia, and the discomfort in his chest grew. "Mr. Collins, I know I'm behind on rent, but I've managed to get the full amount." Michael went to an envelope in the drawer and handed it to Richard. 3 months with interest as per the contract. I apologize for the trouble." Richard took the envelope, surprised. He had expected empty apologies or promises of future payment, not the full amount in cash. "I had an accident at the hospital 4 months ago. A patient in a fit pushed me, and I ended up fracturing my wrist. I was on leave, receiving only part of my salary and with 2 children to feed," Michael explained, without a tone of self-pity, just stating facts. "But I've gone back to working at 2 hospitals now, and I won't fall behind again." Richard looked around, noticing the children's drawings stuck on the fridge, the children's books neatly arranged on the shelf, the pressed nurses' uniform hanging, ready for the next shift. It was the home of a family fighting honestly to survive. The eviction plan Richard had in his briefcase now seemed absurdly cruel. He knew legally he was within his rights to demand the property be vacated, even with the late payment. The construction company had already approved the plans to demolish this row of houses and build the luxury condominium that would triple his assets. "Mr. Stevens, the late payment is important," Richard began, choosing his words carefully. "But there's another issue. This property is part of a lot that will be used for a new development. All tenants have already been notified about the need to vacate." Michael's face showed pure desperation. "A new development? But this has been our home for 5 years. Mr. Collins, since my wife passed, it's the only home my children have known. Their school is nearby. Mrs. Murphy helps us." He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "How much time do we have?" Richard felt the words stick in his throat. He should say 30 days, as stated in the eviction notice in his briefcase. But for the first time in years since he had lost Olivia, something inside him seemed to crack. "We can "Discuss this," he replied to his own surprise. "It won't be immediate." A glimmer of hope appeared in Michael's tired eyes. At that moment, Ethan appeared at the kitchen door. "Daddy, Lucy wants to know if the rent man is staying for lunch. Mrs. Murphy said there's enough soup." Richard and Michael exchanged glances, both equally surprised by the unexpected invitation. Before either could respond, Richard's phone rang. It was his partner, impatient for news about the property's vacancy. "I need to take this," Richard said, heading to the door. Before leaving, he turned to Michael. "We'll talk again about the property situation. For now, consider the late payment settled." Michael nodded, gratitude evident in his exhausted gaze. As he left the house, Richard passed by the vase of wilted sunflowers. On an impulse he didn't quite understand. He pulled out some bills from his wallet and handed them to Ethan, who was watching from the door. "To buy new sunflowers," he said, forcing an awkward smile. "Your mother, she liked them." Ethan looked at the money, hesitant. "Mommy planted these before she went to heaven. Daddy tries to keep them alive, but he's not very good with plants." Richard nodded, feeling something strange in his throat. "Then buy water for them, or whatever they need." As he walked back to his luxury car, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the unsettling coincidence. Sunflowers were Olivia's favorite flowers. She said they were flowers that always sought the light, even on the darkest days. Since losing her to cancer 5 years ago, Richard had become a cold and calculating man, burying himself in work to avoid facing the pain. Now an unfamiliar family had inadvertently touched wounds he thought had healed. In the car, he answered his partner's call. "So, Collins, has the tenant signed the eviction notice yet?" Richard glanced at the little house with the blue door in the rearview mirror. "I'll need more time, Howard. There are complications." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. In the days that followed, Richard Collins found himself making decisions that surprised even him. He postponed 2 important investor meetings and asked his lawyers to review the purchase contract for the houses in Astoria, looking for loopholes or ways to relocate the residents more humanely. His secretary, Rebecca, was puzzled by her boss's behavior. He had always been known for his objectivity and coldness in business decisions. Richard Collins was respected and feared precisely because he never let emotions interfere with his real estate projects. What she didn't know was that visiting that house with the blue door had awakened memories and feelings long buried inside him. One Thursday afternoon, Richard decided to drive through the neighborhood again, unannounced. He told himself it was just to assess the land in person and consider alternatives for the project. But the truth was, he couldn't shake the image of those children and their exhausted father fighting to keep them together. When he parked, he noticed the house seemed empty. He knocked a few times, but no one answered. He was about to leave when he heard a familiar voice. "If you're looking for Michael, he's at the hospital. A 24-hour shift." Mrs. Murphy watched him from the garden of the house next door, where she was watering some plants. Richard approached, oddly relieved to see a familiar face. "And the kids?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "They're with me until tomorrow," the woman replied with a kind smile. "Would you like to see them? They're just finishing their homework." Richard hesitated. What reason would a busy businessman like him have to visit 2 children he barely knew? Still, he nodded. "Actually, I brought something for their garden." He walked back to the car and grabbed a bag of fertilized soil and a new pot for the sunflowers, things he'd bought on impulse earlier that day. Mrs. Murphy smiled as if she understood something even Richard didn't. "Come, they'll love it, especially Lucy. That girl has a special fondness for those flowers. She says her mother watches over her through them." Mrs. Murphy's house was warm and full of plants. At the kitchen table, Ethan was focused on a math notebook, while Lucy colored a drawing with her tongue sticking out in concentration. When she saw Richard, the little girl's eyes lit up. "The rent man," she exclaimed, running to hug his legs, leaving Richard completely stunned. Ethan stood up more reservedly but smiled too. "Did you come to see our dad? He won't be back until tomorrow. Actually, Richard cleared his throat, unused to such spontaneous displays of affection. "I brought some things for your sunflowers." Over the next hour, Richard found himself helping the children replant the wilted sunflowers in the new pot. Lucy chattered non-stop about school, her friends, and how her dad told the most amazing bedtime stories. Ethan, though quieter, also opened up, sharing his dream of becoming a doctor, like Dad, but for kids. "Your father's a doctor?" Richard asked, confused. "No, he's a nurse," Ethan corrected proudly, "but he's almost like a doctor. He saves lives too." Last week he helped save an elderly man who had a heart attack. As the children chatted, Mrs. Murphy served coffee to Richard and watched him carefully. "You know, Mr. Collins, this neighborhood isn't just a bunch of houses," she said when the children got distracted by the sunflowers. "It's a community. When Emily left, we all took turns helping Michael with the kids. When Lucy caught pneumonia last year, it was the baker on the corner who lent his car to take her to the hospital at night. Here, no one is left alone." The woman's words had an unexpected impact on Richard. How long had it been since he'd experienced that kind of human connection? In his mansion on the Upper East Side, he lived surrounded by luxury, yet completely alone. After Olivia died, he buried himself in work, pushing even close friends away. "Mrs. Murphy," he suddenly asked, "how long have you lived here?" "Oh, my dear," she smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "I came here with my Walter over 40 years ago. We raised our children in that house. Now they're scattered across the world, but this is still their home. When they visit, it's like time hasn't passed at all." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He remembered his own childhood in a simple house in upstate New York before business success turned him into the man he was today. As dusk fell, Richard said goodbye, promising to return another day. On the drive home, his phone rang several times, but he didn't answer. For the first time in years, he had no desire to talk about investments, projects, or profits. Arriving at his silent mansion, with its vast empty spaces and impersonal decor chosen by a renowned designer, Richard felt the stark contrast to the simple yet vibrant home he'd just visited. In his walk-in closet, as he changed out of his expensive suit into more comfortable clothes, his eyes landed on a box tucked away in the back of a drawer. Hesitating, he opened it. Inside were the last tangible reminders of Olivia. A few letters, the engagement ring she'd worn when they first met, before he replaced it with a far more expensive one, and a photograph of them at the beach during their honeymoon. They were young, smiling, full of plans. "What would you say about me now, Olivia?" he thought, running his finger over the photo. The woman who had taught him to see beauty in simple things surely wouldn't recognize the cold man he'd become. That night, Richard slept poorly, haunted by dreams where Olivia scolded him for his choices, while sunflowers burst through the concrete of his buildings, cracking their foundations. The next morning, arriving at his office, he realized he'd made a decision. Though he wasn't yet sure what the next step would be, he called his secretary. "Rebecca, I need you to gather some information on Michael Stevens, a nurse living in one of the houses on the Astoria property. I want to know which hospitals he works at, his professional background, everything you can find." Rebecca looked surprised, but nodded and left to complete the task. Less than 2 hours later, she returned with a folder. "Mr. Collins, here's what I found on Mr. Stevens. He works at Queens General Hospital and picks up extra shifts at Mount Sinai Hospital. He's 35, a widower, 2 children. She hesitated before continuing. "There's something interesting. 3 months ago, he was one of the nurses who treated Mr. Walter Fisher during a cardiac arrest. Mr. Fisher survived thanks to the team's quick intervention." Richard froze at the name. "Walter Fisher, are you sure?" "Yes, sir. There's a formal thank you note from Mr. Fisher to the team, specifically mentioning Nurse Michael Stevens." Richard dismissed his secretary and spent a few minutes absorbing the information. Walter Fisher had been Richard's mentor early in his career, one of the few friends he still kept in touch with. 3 months ago, when he heard about Walter's heart attack, Richard had sent flowers to the hospital, but he was on a business trip and couldn't visit. And now he discovered that the man whose house he planned to demolish had helped save his friend's life. The coincidences were becoming more and more unsettling, That afternoon, Richard did something he hadn't done in months. He called Walter Fisher and invited him to dinner. Walter, a 72-year-old man with the vitality of someone much younger, welcomed Richard into his home in Beverly Hills with obvious joy. "Richard, my boy, so good to see you. I was starting to think you'd forgotten this old man," he said, patting the businessman on the back. During dinner, Richard subtly steered the conversation toward the heart attack. "By the way, Walter, I heard you had quite a scare a few months ago. How's your recovery going?" The older man's face lit up. "Thank God and the wonderful hospital staff, I'm still here to tell the tale. You know, Richard, when you're at death's door, you see things clearly." I realized how much time I'd wasted on worries that don't matter. Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Do you remember the people who treated you?" "I remember one young nurse in particular. While the doctors rushed through procedures, he held my hand and whispered in my ear that I had to fight, that I still had so much to live for." Something in his voice. Walter paused, emotional. Later, I found out his name was Michael, an extraordinary young man, a widower raising 2 kids alone, and yet there's a kindness in his eyes that's rare these days. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as if the universe was sending signals he could no longer ignore. "Walter, I need to ask you something. When you were in that critical state, what went through your mind?" The older man smiled serenely. "I thought about the people I love, about moments of human connection, about Sunday mornings with my grandkids, about how I just wanted more time to be with them. I didn't think about my money, my properties, or my stocks," he laughed. "What we take from this life, Richard, are the seeds of love we plant. The rest stays behind." Richard drove home feeling the weight of those words. As he entered his empty mansion, he thought again of the house with the blue door, the wilted sunflowers, and the children who, despite losing their mother so young, seemed full of life and hope. The next morning, he made a decision. He called Howard, his business partner. "Howard, we need to rethink the Astoria project." "What do you mean, rethink?" His partner's voice was irritated. "We've already invested a fortune in this. The permits are approved." "I know, but I've been thinking. What if instead of demolishing, we renovated the houses? Kept the original architecture but modernized the interiors? We could turn it into a boutique residential complex, something with historic value. Preserved properties are appreciating more than new builds in some areas." "Have you been drinking?" "Richard?" Howard interrupted, incredulous. "Those old houses aren't worth half of what we'd make from a luxury condo. Since when do you care about historic preservation?" Richard sighed. "Just consider it. Run the numbers, see if it's viable. It's a market differentiator. This is about that house where you went to collect rent, isn't it? Rebecca mentioned you've been obsessed with it. What happened there, Richard? Did someone put a spell on you?" "Just think about the proposal, Howard," Richard replied, ending the call. While Howard was probably cursing on the other end of the line, Richard made another decision. He would visit Michael Stevens at the hospital where he worked. He needed to speak with the man directly, without the children around, to understand why that family affected him so deeply. Queens General Hospital was an old building, with narrow hallways and a constant bustle of patients and staff. Richard felt out of place in his expensive suit, drawing curious glances as he asked for Michael Stevens at the reception desk. "Nurse Michael is on the 3rd floor, pediatric wing," the receptionist informed him, eyeing him suspiciously. "But he's on duty, sir. It's important. I promise not to take much of his time." Richard went up to the 3rd floor and felt even more out of place as he entered the colorful wing where children in various stages of treatment played, slept, or received medication. Some looked quite frail, which made his heart ache. That's when he spotted Michael, dressed in blue scrubs, helping a girl around 10 years old walk down the hallway while holding her IV stand. "See, Amy? You can already make it all the way. Around the hallway," he encouraged, his voice filled with genuine kindness. "Soon you'll be running faster than me." The girl laughed, though she seemed tired from the effort. "You promise to dance with me when I get better, Mr. Stevens?" "I promise, and I'm a terrible dancer, so you'll have to teach me the steps." It was only when they turned back, toward the room, that Michael noticed Richard standing in the hallway. His smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Mr. Collins, is something wrong? The kids, they're fine, Richard quickly reassured him. I just wanted to talk to you, when you have a moment. Michael nodded, still confused. My shift's almost over. You can wait for me in the cafeteria on the first floor. 40 minutes later, Michael found Richard sitting alone in a corner of the hospital's simple cafeteria. He had changed out of his scrubs into civilian clothes, but the fatigue was still visible on his face. You scared me showing up here, he said, sitting across from Richard. I thought something had happened to my house or the kids. Richard gestured to the server, ordering 2 coffees. Sorry about that. Actually, I came because... He hesitated, unsure how to explain what even he didn't fully understand. I found out you helped save the life of a friend of mine, Walter Fisher. Michael's face lit up with recognition. Mr. Fisher, of course I remember him, such a kind man. He sent us a beautiful thank you letter afterward. How is he? Good. Recovered. Richard studied Michael's face, trying to figure out what it was about this unassuming man that intrigued him so much. He spoke very highly of you. Michael smiled, embarrassed. I just did my job. The whole team worked hard to save him. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. The server brought the coffees, and Michael thanked her with a genuine smile that made the young woman blush. Mr. Collins, I imagine you didn't come all this way just to talk about Mr. Fisher, Michael finally said, looking at Richard. It's about the house, isn't it? Are you really going to evict us? Richard took a deep breath. I'm reconsidering the whole project, actually. I've been thinking a lot since I visited your home. The relief on Michael's face was clear. That would mean so much to us. To the whole neighborhood, really. Those houses are more than just walls, you know, they're stories, memories. Like you and your wife. The words slipped out before Richard could stop them. Michael looked surprised but nodded. I met Emily when we were students. Me in nursing, her in education. We had 5 wonderful years together before... He paused, the pain still evident in his eyes. Lucy's pregnancy was complicated. From the start. The doctors suggested terminating it, warned about the risks, but Emily, she wanted that baby so badly. She said she already loved her daughter more than her own life. Richard felt a lump in his throat. Olivia had also gotten pregnant in the early years of their marriage. They lost the baby in the 2nd trimester, and the doctors said she couldn't try again. It was the beginning of a depression that, years later, would keep her from fighting cancer with all her strength. I'm so sorry, Michael, he said sincerely. Life goes on, doesn't it? Michael gave a sad smile. For them, for the little ones, we find strength where we never thought we had any. Do you have children? Richard shook his head. My wife and I, we couldn't, and she's gone too. Cancer, 5 years ago. Michael's eyes filled with understanding. Suddenly, these 2 very different men shared a common pain, a void nothing could fill. Then you understand, Michael said softly, what it's like to live with the ghost of someone we loved. Richard nodded, unable to speak. For years, he'd buried himself in work to avoid facing the emptiness Olivia left behind. He built and demolished buildings, negotiated millions, but couldn't rebuild his own life. The sunflowers, he finally said. My wife loved them too. Michael smiled. Emily used to say they were flowers that always seek the light, no matter how dark the day. She planted those just before he hesitated. I've tried to keep them alive since then, but I don't have much of a green thumb. I noticed. Richard smiled faintly. Your children are special, Michael. Lucy has the most genuine smile I've ever seen. Takes after her mother. Michael checked his watch. I need to pick them up from Mrs. Murphy's. If you'd like, well, you'd be welcome to join us for dinner. It's nothing fancy, but the kids would be happy, especially Lucy. She hasn't stopped talking about the rental guy. Richard hesitated. Part of him wanted to accept immediately. Another part, the one built over years of emotional isolation, warned about the dangers of getting too involved. What would Howard say? Or his secretary? A millionaire having dinner at a nurse's humble home. But then he remembered Walter's words. What we take from this life are the seeds of love we plant. I'd love to, he replied, surprising himself. Dinner at Michael's house was a revelation for Richard. The meal was simple. Rice, beans, roasted meat and salad, but tasty and made with care. The children, after their initial shyness, bombarded Richard with questions about what it's like to own houses and if he had a private jet like the rich people. On TV. "Kids, that's rude," Michael scolded, embarrassed. Richard laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I don't have a jet, Ethan, but I've been on a few." "Is it like a bus with wings?" Lucy asked, wide-eyed. Throughout the meal, Richard watched how Michael interacted with his children, the patience to explain things to Lucy, the way he encouraged Ethan to talk about his day at school, the tenderness in small gestures, like wiping sauce off the girl's face or pouring the boy more juice. He was a present father despite his long work hours. After dinner, when the children went to brush their teeth before bed, Michael served Richard coffee on the small back porch. From there they could see a patch of starry sky, a rarity in polluted New York City. "Thank you for having me, Michael," Richard said, feeling strangely at home in that simple space. "The kids loved it, especially Lucy. She misses having a male figure in her life besides me. Ethan at least has some memories of his mother, but she..." Richard felt his heart tighten. "She's an amazing child. Both of them are. You're doing a great job, Michael." The nurse smiled, tired but visibly proud. "I do my best. It's not always enough, but..." "It's more than enough," Richard interrupted with conviction. He hesitated before continuing. "I've been seriously thinking about changing the real estate project, transforming the houses instead of demolishing them, preserving the community." Michael's face lit up with hope. "That would be extraordinary, Mr. Collins, not just for us, but for all the neighbors. For Mrs. Murphy, for old Jerry at the bakery, for Mrs. O'Malley who sells snacks on the corner. Everyone has stories in this place." It was exactly what Richard feared, and yet was beginning to value. Those weren't just old buildings. They were homes to real people, with stories intertwined. It was a community in the truest sense of the word. As he was about to leave, he heard Lucy's sleepy voice. "Mr. Landlord, will you read us a bedtime story?" Michael started to say Richard needed to go, but the businessman surprised everyone. "Just a short one, okay? It's already late." Sitting on the edge of the children's bed, Richard read a story about a bear afraid of the dark, who learned to find stars in the night. As he read, he watched Lucy's eyes fighting sleep and Ethan listening intently, as if judging the adult's performance in the sacred task of storytelling. When he finished, Lucy was already fast asleep. Ethan, however, asked a question that caught Richard off guard. "Don't you have kids?" "No, Ethan, I don't." "Why not?" Richard thought about how to explain the complexity of his life simply. "Sometimes life doesn't go as planned," he finally answered. "My wife and I really wanted to, but it wasn't possible." Ethan nodded, understanding beyond his years. "You can borrow ours sometimes, especially Lucy. She talks a lot." Richard felt his eyes burn with unshed tears. He gently rested his hand on the boy's head. "Thank you, Ethan. That's a very generous offer." When he left the house, Richard realized something fundamental had shifted inside him. It wasn't just the decision about the real estate project. It was something deeper, a reconnection with parts of himself he'd buried along with Olivia. The next day, he called his architects for an emergency meeting. "I want a completely new proposal for the Astoria site," he announced, shocking the team. "We'll preserve the houses, update the infrastructure, keep the original facades, but modernize the interiors. A preserved urban village concept with revitalized common areas." The architects exchanged confused glances, but began taking notes. Howard, his partner, walked in mid-meeting and listened, arms crossed, to the complete reversal of the plans they'd made together. When everyone left, Howard confronted Richard. "Have you lost sight of how much we'll lose with this change? We bought that land for its development potential, not to play charity and preserve old little houses." Richard stayed calm. "It's not charity, Howard. It's a different approach. A valued market niche. Homes with history in the heart of New York City." "It's because of that nurse, isn't it?" Howard accused. "Rebecca told me you had dinner at his place last night. Richard Collins, the real estate shark, dining with a delinquent tenant. What's happening to you?" Richard sighed. "Maybe I'm finally seeing beyond the numbers, Howard. Maybe it's time to build something that leaves a different legacy." Legacy? Since when do you care about that? We're developers, Richard. We buy, demolish, build, sell. That's the natural cycle of our business. Things can change, replied Richard, with a calmness that surprised even himself. If you can't see the opportunity in this, I can buy your share in the project. Howard laughed, incredulous. And pay with what? All your available capital. Fair's tied up in your other ventures. Richard didn't hesitate. I'll sell my house on the Upper East Side if I have to. The mansion he had built with Olivia. The ultimate symbol of his success and, in recent years, his lonely refuge. The idea of selling it should have been terrifying, but strangely it brought a sense of liberation. You're out of your mind, declared Howard, heading for the door. Completely insane. Call me when you come to your senses. But Richard knew he wouldn't back down. For the first time in years, he felt completely certain about a decision. 2 weeks passed. Richard visited Michael's house regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts for the children, books for Ethan, art supplies for Lucy. He also spoke with the other residents, listening to their stories, understanding what that little corner of the neighborhood meant to them. With Walter Fisher's help, he secured alternative financing, allowing him to buy Howard's share in the project without selling his home. Plans for revitalizing the houses moved forward, even gaining attention from the local media as a rare case of historic preservation and sustainable development in New York City. One Saturday afternoon, Richard organized a small event on the vacant lot behind the houses. He invited all the residents and set up a large screen to present the revitalization project. There was food, drinks, and even a small musical performance by local youth. When Michael arrived with the children, Richard felt an inexplicable joy seeing Lucy's smile at the sight of the colorful balloons. Ethan, always more reserved, gave a discreet wave, as if they shared a secret. "What's all this, Mr. Collins?" asked Michael, eyeing the gathered neighbors with curiosity. "A surprise," Richard replied with a smile. "And please, after all this, I think it's time you called me Richard." When everyone had gathered, Richard stepped onto a small, makeshift stage. "Good afternoon, everyone. Many of you know me as the owner of these houses, and you've probably heard rumors about demolition and eviction," he began, noticing the tension in the faces watching him. "Today I'm here to share a different vision for the future of this place you call home." On the screen, images of the renewed project appeared. The same houses, their facades preserved but structurally reinforced and modernized inside. Common spaces transformed into small plazas, community gardens and gathering areas. "This won't be another luxury development pushing you out," Richard continued. "This will be Magnolia Gardens, a revitalized community where you, the current residents, will have priority to buy or rent at affordable rates, with special terms for those who've lived here over 5 years. A murmur of surprise and joy spread through the crowd. Mrs. Murphy pressed her hands to her face, moved. Michael stared at Richard as if he couldn't believe it. Over the next few days, representatives from the company will visit each family to discuss individual terms. Construction will begin with structural reinforcement and infrastructure, and you'll be able to stay in your homes for most of the process. When Richard stepped down, he was surrounded by grateful residents, some even with tears in their eyes. Mrs. O'Malley, the woman who sold snacks on the corner, clasped his hands in hers, rough from decades of work. "You have no idea what this means to us after seeing so many people forced from their homes in this city." Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had never been the recipient of such genuine gratitude before. His luxury ventures earned millions, but no client had ever looked at him with the emotion he saw on those simple faces. When he finally managed to step away from the crowd, he found Michael standing near the sunflowers they had replanted together, now blooming vibrantly. "Why, Richard?" the nurse asked, his voice choked with emotion. "Why give up millions to preserve these old houses?" Richard pondered the question for a moment, watching the children playing happily with other kids from the neighborhood. "Because some values can't be measured in money," he finally replied, "and because for the first time in many years, I feel like I'm building something that truly matters." Just then, Lucy came running up to them, holding a drawing she had just made. "Uncle Richard, look! I drew our new home." Richard crouched, down to see the picture. On the sheet of paper, the little artist had drawn the blue house, the sunflowers, and 4 stick figures: herself, Ethan, their father, and a man in a suit who could only be Richard. "It's beautiful, Lucy," he said, his voice trembling. "Mommy is taking care of the sunflowers from heaven," the little girl explained, pointing to a figure among the clouds. "And you're taking care of us down here." Michael and Richard exchanged an emotional glance as little Lucy, satisfied with her masterpiece, ran back to play with the other children. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, the following months brought significant changes, not only to the small neighborhood of Astoria, but also to Richard Collins' life. The Magnolia Gardens project progressed steadily, with teams working carefully to preserve the historic character of the homes while modernizing their structure and facilities. The renovations began with common areas and infrastructure, allowing residents to stay in their homes during the process. What had started as an act of compassion was turning into an innovative business model for Richard. Architecture and urban planning media took an interest in the project, highlighting it as a rare example of socially responsible real estate development in New York City. Investors who had initially questioned the financial viability of the proposal now showed interest in joining. Yet it wasn't potential profits that motivated Richard to visit the construction site 3 times a week. It was the feeling of creating something meaningful, something that transformed the real lives of people he now deeply cared about. One Wednesday afternoon, Richard walked through the neighborhood, checking the progress of the work, when his phone rang. It was his secretary, Rebecca, with unexpected news. "Mr. Collins, the governor is interested in learning about the Magnolia Gardens project. His office reached out suggesting a visit next week." Richard frowned in surprise. "The governor? Why?" "It seems he's looking for urban revitalization models for a new state program. The positive media coverage of our project caught his attention." Hanging up, Richard continued his walk, reflecting on how a decision made for such personal reasons could have such far-reaching effects. He turned a corner and spotted the school, where Lucy and Ethan studied. Classes had ended, and children streamed out of the gates, some meeting waiting parents, others forming small groups to walk home. He recognized Ethan immediately, holding his little sister's hand firmly as they waited on the sidewalk. When Lucy saw him, her face lit up. "Uncle Richard," she called, waving excitedly. Richard felt his heart grow warm. The little girl had spontaneously started calling him uncle after the 3rd or 4th visit, and he hadn't had the heart to correct her. "What are you doing around here?" asked Ethan, always more reserved but with a genuine smile. "I was checking on the construction site and decided to stop by to see how you all were doing," Richard replied, realizing it wasn't entirely true. Unconsciously, he had timed his visit to coincide with the kids getting out of school. "Can we get ice cream?" Lucy asked, her hopeful eyes making it harder for Richard to resist each time. "Lucy," Ethan scolded, "Dad said we can only have ice cream on weekends." Richard laughed. "Well, technically that wasn't a request, just a question, and I think I can talk to your dad about making a special exception today." He called Michael, who was in the middle of a hospital shift. "Sure, Richard, if it's not too much trouble," the nurse replied, sounding tired but grateful. "I get off at 6 today. Can you drop them off with Mrs. Murphy afterward?" "Actually, I was thinking of taking them to the movies after ice cream. There's a new animated film playing that I think they'd like. I can bring them home after, if that's all right with you." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure? You must have more important things to do than entertain 2 kids. Richard looked at Lucy and Ethan, who were watching him expectantly. "Nothing more important than this, Michael. I promise to return them in one piece and not too sugared up." After hanging up, Richard turned to the kids with a conspiratorial smile. "Ice cream and movies, approved by Command Central." Lucy jumped with joy while Ethan tried to keep a straight face, though the excitement in his eyes was unmistakable. The afternoon with the kids was one of the happiest Richard could remember in years. The way Lucy marveled at simple scoops of ice cream as if they were the greatest treasure in the world. How Ethan tried so hard to act mature, but ended up laughing uncontrollably during the funny scenes in the movie. At one point, when the theater darkened and Lucy's small hand reached for his, he felt such an intense emotion he could barely breathe. Was this what it would have been like if he'd had children with Olivia? This simple joy, this deep meaning in small moments. How many years had he lost buried in business, accumulating wealth he couldn't share? By the time he dropped the kids off at home that evening, he found Michael just arriving, exhausted from the hospital. The dark circles and pallor on his face betrayed his fatigue. "Thanks for looking after them," the nurse said as the kids rushed inside, eager to tell their dad about the movie. "They love spending time with you." Richard studied the man in front of him, someone who worked tirelessly, pulled double shifts, cared for sick strangers at the hospital, and still had the energy to be a present and loving father. He compared it to his own life, materially comfortable but empty of real connections. "I'm the one who should be thanking you, Michael. They bring life to my days." Michael smiled knowingly. Kids have that power. They remind us what really matters. Before saying goodbye, Richard hesitated. "Michael, the governor wants to visit the Magnolia Gardens project next week. I'm thinking of holding a small event with the residents. It'd be great if you and the kids could be there." The nurse looked surprised. "The governor? Wow, the project's really grown beyond what anyone expected. Actually, I'd like you to speak a bit about the community, what this place means to the families living here. No one could do that better than you." Michael blinked, visibly, taken aback by the request. "Me, but I'm no good at speeches. And in front of the governor?" Richard smiled. "You face medical emergencies every day. A little speech can't be more frightening than that." After a moment of hesitation, Michael nodded. "I'll do my best." The following week, the small lot behind the houses, now transformed into a temporary central square, was simply yet tastefully decorated to welcome the governor. The residents, dressed in their best clothes, chatted excitedly, still hardly believing their modest neighborhood would host such an important figure. Richard, impeccable in his suit, was giving final instructions to the team when he noticed something different about Michael. The nurse had gotten a haircut and wore a new dress shirt clearly bought for the occasion. Beside him, Ethan was also neatly dressed in his best outfit, and Lucy wore a floral dress with her hair carefully tied in little braids. "You all look wonderful," Richard remarked, smiling at the trio. "Lucy picked the dress herself," Michael explained. "She said she needed to look pretty to meet the King of New York City." Richard laughed. "Not quite a king, little one, but I'm sure he'll think you're the prettiest princess he's ever seen." The arrival of the governor and his entourage brought a flurry of activity to the neighborhood. With cameras and reporters in tow, the official toured part of the construction, spoke with some residents, and listened attentively to Richard's presentation about the project's vision. "The most important thing in Magnolia Gardens isn't the preserved architecture or the technical innovations," Richard explained as they walked. "It's the fact that we're revitalizing without displacing the original community. These people have roots here, stories, connections." The governor nodded, impressed. "Collins, when I heard the real estate shark had abandoned a high-end luxury project to preserve old houses, I'll admit I was curious. Now I understand why. There's something special here." On the small stage set up for speeches, Richard was brief and to the point, outlining the technical aspects of the project and thanking everyone for coming. Then he called Michael to the microphone. The nurse stepped onto the stage, visibly nervous, clutching a small piece of paper with notes. He glanced at the audience, at the governor, and then at his children in the front row. Lucy was waving excitedly, while Ethan watched his father with unmistakable pride. I'm not good with words," Michael began, his voice trembling. "But I'm good at observing people. It's part of my job as a nurse. And what I've observed in this neighborhood over the 7 years I've lived here is the true meaning of community." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "When my wife left us and I was alone with 2 small children, it wasn't social programs or institutions that held me up. It was neighbors like Mrs. Murphy, who watched the kids when I had to work. It was old Jerry from the bakery, who often forgot to charge me for bread when he knew we were struggling. It was Mrs. O'Malley and her tapioca cart, who always set aside one for Ethan and Lucy on Sunday mornings. Richard watched, moved, as Michael spoke with growing eloquence about what it meant to belong to a place, to put down roots and make memories, about how his house with the blue door had become a safe harbor for his children amid the storm of losing their mother so young. What Mr. Richard Collins is doing here isn't just preserving buildings, Michael continued, looking directly at the businessman. He's preserving stories, bonds, memories. He's teaching us that progress doesn't have to mean destruction, that we can build the future while honoring the past. When he finished his speech, Michael received a standing ovation from everyone present. The governor, visibly moved, shook his hand warmly and asked to meet his children. Lucy, overcoming any shyness, hugged the governor's leg and asked if he also lived in a blue house, making everyone laugh. After the event, when most of the guests had already dispersed, Richard found Michael sitting alone on a bench in the makeshift square. The children played with other kids from the neighborhood, enjoying the last rays of the afternoon sun. "Your speech was incredible," said Richard, sitting beside him. "I spoke from the heart," Michael replied simply. "What you've done for us, for this community, there aren't enough words to thank you." Richard shook his head. "I didn't do it for gratitude, Michael. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And because," he hesitated, choosing his words, "you helped me find a part of myself that was lost." They watched the children playing together. Lucy was now trying to teach a complicated clapping game to a friend, while Ethan organized an impromptu soccer match with the older boys. "I never imagined I could feel so much joy again after Emily passed," Michael confessed quietly. "The kids, they're my strength, my purpose." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "You're lucky, Michael. After losing Olivia, I lost myself in empty ambition. I built taller buildings, made more money, but inside, it was all hollow. And now?" Richard looked at Lucy, who had noticed his presence and was waving enthusiastically. "Now I'm relearning what really matters, thanks to you." Richard's phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Walter Fisher with important news about a potential new investor for the project. As he answered, he stepped away a few paces, keeping an eye on the playing children. When he hung up, he found Michael still sitting, watching him thoughtfully. "Good news?" the nurse asked. "Great news," Richard confirmed. "A foreign investment group is interested in the Magnolia Gardens model. They want to replicate it in other historic areas of the city." Michael smiled. "See? In the end, doing the right thing can also be good business." Richard nodded, but his expression suddenly turned serious. "Michael, I need to ask you something. Something I've been thinking about for weeks." The nurse looked at him curiously. "What is it?" Richard hesitated, as if carefully measuring his next words. "The house you live in, I'd like to transfer it to your name. No cost, no strings attached. A formal donation." Michael blinked several times as if he hadn't understood correctly. "What, you want to give me the house?" "Exactly," Richard confirmed. "The other residents will have special conditions to buy their homes after the renovation at prices well below market value. But in your case, I'd like it to be a direct transfer." Michael stood up, visibly shaken. "I can't accept this, Richard. It's too much, and I haven't done anything to deserve it." Richard also stood facing his friend. "You and your children gave me something no amount of money could buy, Michael. You gave me a new perspective on life. You reminded me of what really matters." The nurse shook his head, still resistant. "That's not something you repay with a house, Richard. It's friendship, it's humanity." "I'm not repaying anything," Richard insisted. "I want to make sure you and the kids have security, that you never have to worry about where you'll live. It's," he hesitated, "a gesture of care, of family." The word family hung between them, heavy with meaning. Michael looked at his children, thoughtful. Finally, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what to say, Richard. This would change our lives completely." "Say yes," Richard replied simply. "Let me do this for you. Please." After a long moment of hesitation, Michael nodded slowly. "On one condition," he said finally, "that you continue to be part of these children's lives. They have grown attached to you, especially Lucy. Richard felt such intense emotion that he needed a few seconds before he could speak. "That's not a condition, Michael, it's a privilege." That night, as he returned to his mansion on the Upper East Side, Richard walked through the empty rooms with new eyes. The luxurious spaces, once designed for a family that never grew, now felt cold and purposeless. On the living room wall, a single portrait of Olivia watched him, and Richard had the strange sensation that she was smiling in approval at the changes in his life. In his office, he opened his laptop and began researching something he'd been considering for weeks: volunteer opportunities at children's hospitals. Something to fill the hours he once dedicated solely to making more money. As he browsed the websites, his phone buzzed with a message from Michael, a photo of Lucy asleep, clutching the small stuffed bear Richard had given her, with the caption, "Someone dreaming about today's movie." Richard smiled at the screen, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. The path ahead wasn't entirely clear yet, but for the first time since Olivia's death, he felt he was moving in the right direction. The following months brought swift changes, both for Magnolia Gardens and Richard's personal life. The revitalization project progressed steadily, with the first houses fully renovated and ready to be lived in again. The transfer of Michael's house into his name was completed quietly, with a simple ceremony in Richard's office, where the nurse, still emotional, received the final deed to the property. The project's success drew national and even international attention, with specialized publications highlighting the innovative model of urban revitalization that preserved not just the architecture, but the community's social fabric. Richard received invitations for lectures and consultations, and his company began repositioning itself in the market as an expert in sustainable development and historic preservation. But the biggest change wasn't in business, it was in his personal life. Richard completely reorganized his schedule to have more free time. He reduced his workload, delegated responsibilities, and, to his secretary's surprise, started turning down weekend commitments. Those days were now sacred, reserved for outings with Ethan and Lucy, soccer games in the park, museum visits, and sometimes just lazy afternoons watching movies at Michael's house. On one such Saturday afternoon, as Lucy and Ethan played in the backyard, now filled with thriving sunflowers, Richard and Michael chatted on the small porch watching the children. "The Central Plaza renovations should be done in 2 weeks," Richard remarked, taking a sip of coffee. "The kids will love the new playground." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Everything changed so fast. Sometimes I still wake up thinking it's all a dream, that I'll get an eviction notice any minute." Richard laughed. "Well, technically you can't be evicted now, you own the place." The nurse shook his head, still amazed by the turn his life had taken. "You know what Lucy asked me the other day? If you were going to move in with us when the renovations were done?" Richard nearly choked on his coffee. "What?" "Yeah," Michael smiled. "She thinks you look too lonely in that big house." Her words. Richard fell silent for a moment, watching the little girl swing on the makeshift swing they'd hung from a backyard tree. "Kids have an incredible way of seeing things," he said finally. "Actually, I have been thinking about moving. The house on the Upper East Side is too big for just one person. I was considering an apartment closer to here." Michael studied him carefully. "Why?" Richard shrugged, trying to seem casual. "Convenience. I've been spending so much time in this neighborhood overseeing the construction and visiting you all, of course." The nurse kept watching him as if waiting for the real answer. Richard sighed. "The truth, Michael, is that house, it's full of ghosts. Memories of what could have been but never was. Olivia and I bought it dreaming of a family we never got to have. After she left, I turned those empty rooms into a mausoleum of memories. It's not a home, it's a prison I built myself." Michael nodded understandingly. "I get that better than you think. In the first few months after Emily passed, I could barely step into our bedroom. If it weren't for the kids needing me." "Exactly," Richard agreed. "The kids gave you a purpose, a reason to keep going." A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched Ethan help his sister climb higher on the swing, his protective care evident. "You'll find your way, Richard," Michael finally said. "And know you'll always have a place here with us, not just as a benefactor or friend, but as family. The word touched Richard deeply. Family. Something he'd given up on after losing Olivia. Something that now, completely unexpectedly, he was beginning to reclaim. That night, returning home, Richard made a decision. He called his realtor and told her he wanted to put the Upper East Side mansion up for sale. It was time to leave the ghosts behind and start a new chapter. In the following weeks, Richard focused on finishing the first phase of Magnolia Gardens. The central square was inaugurated with a small community celebration where Lucy insisted on cutting the ribbon next to Uncle Richard, as she proudly announced to everyone present. The image of the little girl holding the businessman's hand made it into the local papers, illustrating the article about the project. The sale of the mansion happened faster than expected, to a foreign family who had just moved to New York City. Handing the keys to the new owners, a couple with 3 young children, Richard felt not sadness but relief. The house would finally be what it should have been from the start, a home full of children's voices and laughter. He bought a spacious apartment in a newly restored historic building, just a 10-minute walk from Magnolia Gardens. This time, he took part in the decorating. Bright colors, comfortable furniture, and even a room with 2 beds. For when Ethan and Lucy want to sleep over, he explained to the surprised decorator. One Sunday morning, about 8 months after that first visit to the house with the blue door, Richard was making breakfast in his new apartment. He'd invited Michael and the kids to see the finished place and was as nervous as a teenager having his girlfriend over for the first time. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, back to the story. The doorbell rang promptly at 9. When he opened the door, Richard was immediately hugged by Lucy, who practically leaped into his arms. "Uncle Richard, is your apartment a castle?" she asked, peering curiously inside. Richard laughed, scooping her up. "Not a castle, little one. Just a place for me to live. Come on in." Ethan stepped in cautiously, his eyes taking in everything around him. Michael carried a small potted plant which he handed to Richard. "A gift for the new place," he explained. "Guess what it is?" Richard looked at the tiny green sprout barely peeking through the soil. "I have no idea." "A sunflower," Michael replied with a smile. "The kids planted it especially for you." The simplicity of the gesture touched Richard deeply. He placed the pot on the sunny living room windowsill where it would have plenty of light to grow. "It's perfect. Thank you." During breakfast, Richard watched with satisfaction as the 3 seemed completely at ease in his home. Ethan explored the small library he had set up, while Lucy insisted on helping serve the coffee, carefully carrying 1 cup at a time. Michael remarked on how the place suited Richard, elegant yet welcoming, sophisticated yet comfortable. "Come see something," Richard said once they finished eating. He led them down the hallway toward the bedrooms and opened a door. "This is your room, or rather for whenever you want to stay here." The room had been decorated with 2 beds, a desk and shelves filled with carefully selected books and toys. One wall had been painted with chalkboard paint so the kids could draw on it. Lucy immediately ran to the bed with the floral quilt, jumping on it joyfully. Ethan lingered in the doorway, looking at Richard with an unreadable expression. "Is this really ours?" he finally asked. "It's yours," Richard confirmed, "for whenever you want to stay, on weekends or when your dad has night shifts and can't be with you." "Can I sleep here tonight?" Lucy interrupted, already hugging a pillow. Michael and Richard exchanged amused glances. "Not tonight, Princess," Michael replied, "but maybe next weekend." As the kids explored the room, Michael pulled Richard aside into the hallway. I don't even know what to say, Richard. You've already done so much for us, and now it's selfish, really," Richard said with a smile. "I like having you all around. You fill a void I've carried for a long time." Michael nodded in understanding. "Even so, it's an incredible gesture. The kids will love it, especially Lucy. He hesitated for a moment. "She's really been missing a mother figure. And while you're obviously not that, having an adult who cares beyond just her dad makes a huge difference." Richard's heart clenched. He had overheard Lucy asking other girls at school about their mothers, noticed how she curiously watched complete families in parks and restaurants. I would never try to replace Emily, Michael. I hope you know that. The nurse smiled. I do, and I also know she'd be happy to see how important you've become in our kids' lives. The rest of the morning passed quickly with the children, convincing Richard to play board games and then taking them to see the building's rooftop, which offered a panoramic view of the city. When it was time to leave, Lucy clung to Richard's leg. I don't want to go, I want to stay with Uncle Richard. Michael tried to negotiate with his daughter, but she was determined, on the verge of a full-blown tantrum. Lucy, Uncle Richard has commitments and we only planned for this morning, Michael explained, growing embarrassed by his daughter's behavior. To both adults' surprise, Ethan was the one who resolved the situation. He crouched beside his sister and said with the seriousness of his 8 years, Lucy, if we make a fuss, Uncle Richard might not invite us back. And you want to come here again, don't you? The flawless logic worked. Lucy nodded, still reluctant, but took her brother's hand to leave. Can I come back tomorrow? She asked Richard with hopeful eyes. Richard gently explained the concept of schedules and commitments, promising they'd set another day very soon. Satisfied with the promise, the little girl finally said goodbye with a tight hug. After closing the door, Michael looked at his daughter with curiosity. Why do you like Uncle Richard so much, Lucy? The little girl thought for a moment, serious. Because he's nice and because he looks at us like we're special, like in the stories you tell about how Mum used to look at us. The answer, indeed, its childlike simplicity moved Michael. He remembered how Richard, the feared businessman who had come to evict them, had become a constant loving presence in his children's lives. How the man who once cared only about profits and deals now cancelled important meetings to attend Lucy's school performances or Ethan's soccer games. That night, after putting the children to bed, Michael sat on the porch of the house with the blue door, gazing at the stars and the extraordinary changes that had taken place in their lives. Magnolia Gardens was nearly complete. His home now legally belonged to him, and his children had gained not only material security, but also a positive male figure beyond himself. He thought of Emily, and how happy she would be to see their children growing up loved and safe. He thought of how fate had turned a threat, the powerful businessman coming to evict them, into one of the greatest blessings of their lives. Meanwhile, in his new apartment, Richard was also reflecting on life's twists. He looked at a recent, framed photo in the living room, himself, Michael, and the children taken during a park outing. Beside it, the old photo of Olivia, which he had brought from the mansion, no longer a symbol of loss, but a cherished memory of a love that had shaped him. What would you think of all this, Olivia? He wondered, gazing at his wife's picture. He could almost hear her light laughter, her silent approval. It was as if she had guided his steps to that house with the blue door, to that family that had unknowingly filled a void he no longer knew how to name. The next morning, Richard was in his office reviewing the final details of the Magnolia Gardens project when he received an unexpected call. It was from Mount Sinai Hospital, where Michael worked extra shifts. Mr. Collins, this is Dr. Sarah Bennett from the emergency department. I'm calling at the request of Nurse Michael Stevens. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. Is something wrong? He had a minor accident during his shift. He's fine, but he needed stitches on his arm and won't be able to pick up the children from school today. He asked me to contact you. Richard was already grabbing his car keys before hanging up. He cancelled his remaining appointments and went straight to the hospital, where he found Michael sitting on a gurney, his right arm bandaged. Hi, you didn't have to come, the nurse said, visibly embarrassed. I just needed someone to pick up the kids from school. Richard examined the bandage with concern. What happened? A patient in crisis. Tried to hurt himself with a sharp object, and I got cut trying to restrain him. Michael shrugged as if it were routine. Occupational hazard. Nothing serious, but I'll need to keep my arm immobilized for a few days. Richard shook his head, both admiring and worried about his friend. You're going home to rest now. I'll pick up the kids and stay with them until you recover a bit. Michael began to protest, but Richard was firm. Non-negotiable, Michael. You need rest and I can help. That's what friends are for. Besides, he added with a smile, Lucy will be thrilled to finally sleep over at Uncle Richard's. In the hours that followed, Richard experienced an intensive version of the family life he had never known. He picked up the kids from school, carefully explained about their father's minor accident, emphasizing multiple times that he was fine, took them out for lunch, and then to gather clothes and school supplies from home. Lucy, after her initial worry about her dad, was thrilled at the idea of finally sleeping in her new room, while Ethan, more reserved, observed everything with watchful eyes. "Is Daddy going to be alone at home?" the boy asked while packing his backpack. "No, we'll all have dinner together at my place and then we'll see how he's feeling. If he's too tired or in pain, he can stay there too," explained Richard, touched by the boy's concern. Ethan nodded, satisfied with the answer. "I'll grab the medicine he takes for headaches," he said, heading to the bathroom cabinet with the seriousness of a little adult. That night was chaotic and wonderful for Richard. Michael was clearly exhausted and, after some insistence, agreed to stay at Richard's apartment instead of going home. The kids, excited by the novelty, took a long time to settle down, especially Lucy, who wanted to show Richard every detail of the pajamas she'd picked and every stuffed animal she'd brought. When silence finally settled over the apartment, Richard found Michael sitting on the balcony, gazing at the city lights with a thoughtful expression. "The kids are finally asleep," Richard said, sitting in the chair beside him. "Lucy wanted me to read 3 stories before she'd agree to close her eyes." Michael smiled tiredly. "She always tries to bargain for just one more story. Thank you for all of this, Richard. I don't know what I would have done without your help today." "It's my pleasure," Richard replied sincerely. "They're wonderful kids." They sat in silence for a few minutes, enjoying the night breeze and the starry sky. "You know what Lucy asked me before bed?" Michael said suddenly. "She wanted to know if you could be her dad too, since the dad in heaven took her mum away." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "And what did you say?" Michael smiled. "I told her people can have many different kinds of love and family in their lives, that she's very lucky to have not just a dad who loves her, but also an Uncle Richard who cares so much about her." Richard swallowed hard, trying to control the emotion threatening to spill over. "Thank you for that, for sharing them with me." Michael studied him closely. "You're building something important in their lives, Richard. You're becoming family." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Family. Something Richard had given up after losing Olivia. Something he was now, completely unexpectedly, rediscovering. In the days that followed, Richard completely rearranged his schedule to care for the kids while Michael recovered. He drove them to and from school, helped with homework, made dinners, with extremely limited cooking skills leading to some comedic kitchen adventures, and established a routine that, though temporary, felt strangely natural. One afternoon, while waiting for the kids outside school, Richard noticed an elegant woman watching him curiously. After a few minutes, she approached. "Forgive the intrusion, but aren't those Michael Stevens's children?" "The nurse." Richard nodded, immediately on guard. He'd grown protective of the kids, and any approach from strangers made him wary. "I'm Patricia Wilson, the school principal," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "I heard about Michael's accident. How is he?" Richard relaxed. "Getting better. He should be back to work next week." The principal smiled. "That's good. Michael is an exceptional father, despite all the difficulties. It's comforting to see he has such a dedicated friend to help him. We rarely see this kind of support for single parents." Before Richard could respond, the bell rang and children began pouring out of the school gates. Lucy came running as soon as she spotted him, throwing herself into his arms with her usual enthusiasm. Ethan followed more calmly, but still smiled when he saw him. "Hello, Principal Patricia," Lucy greeted cheerfully. "This is Uncle Richard. He's taking care of us while Daddy fixes his arm." The principal smiled at the child. "I see, sweetheart, you're very lucky." As they walked to the car, Richard reflected on the principal's comment. Lucky? The real luck was his. After years of loneliness and focusing solely on work, he'd rediscovered the meaning of the word family. When they arrived at the apartment, they found Michael on the balcony, his arm still bandaged but moving more easily. "Daddy, the teacher said my drawing was the prettiest in the class," Lucy exclaimed, running to her father. "I drew our family, me, Ethan, You and Uncle Richard." Michael exchanged a meaningful look with Richard as he hugged his daughter with his good arm. "It's a very beautiful family indeed, sweetheart," he replied, his voice slightly choked. That night marked Michael's return home, though Richard insisted on continuing to take and pick up the kids from school for a few more days until the nurse fully recovered. What began as a temporary arrangement turned into a routine. Even after Michael's recovery, Richard often picked up the kids on Tuesdays and Thursdays when the nurse had longer shifts. The official opening of Magnolia Gardens took place on a sunny spring Sunday, about a year after Richard's first visit to the house with the blue door. The neighborhood was unrecognizable. The old houses now displayed beautifully restored facades, keeping their original charm but with renewed structure. The central square, once an empty lot, was now a lush green space with a playground, benches, and an area for community events. For the opening ceremony, Richard made sure it wasn't just officials and press, but mainly the residents, the true heroes of this transformation. On the small stage set up under a flower-covered pergola after the formal speeches, he invited Michael and the children to join him in cutting the ribbon. "Magnolia Gardens wouldn't exist without this family," Richard said into the microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "They taught me that building doesn't always mean tearing down what's there, but transforming, preserving, honoring stories. That business success can go hand in hand with respect for people." Lucy, thrilled by the importance of the moment, insisted on holding the scissors alongside Richard and her father. Ethan, more reserved but visibly proud, watched everything with shining eyes. The photo of the four of them cutting the ribbon landed on the front page of newspapers the next day with the headline, "Developer turns real estate project into model of urban revitalization with social preservation." The success of Magnolia Gardens inspired similar projects in other parts of the city. Richard became a reference in sustainable real estate development, receiving invitations for lectures and consultations. His company completely shifted direction, specializing in revitalizing historic areas while preserving their original communities. Yet the biggest impact wasn't on his business, but on his personal life. What began as an act of compassion for two children at the door of a blue house had turned into a new family, not in the traditional sense, but with bonds as deep as blood. 2 years after the whole story began, on a Saturday afternoon, Richard was in his apartment preparing a barbecue on the balcony, a newly acquired skill under Michael's supervision, when his phone rang. It was his personal lawyer. "Mr. Collins, the documents are ready for signing. I can send a messenger on Monday." Richard glanced into the living room, where Lucy, now 7 years old, was intently piecing together a complex puzzle he had given her as a gift. Ethan, 9, patiently explained the strategy to his sister. "Thank you, Doctor, but I'd rather come to your office in person on Monday. It's too important to be handled by a messenger." As he hung up, he felt a mix of nervousness and absolute certainty. The decision he had made wasn't impulsive. It had been carefully considered for months with consultations from lawyers and specialists. Still, the weight of what he was about to do moved him deeply. "What are you thinking about, Uncle Richard?" Ethan asked, stepping onto the balcony. The boy had become incredibly perceptive to Richard's mood changes. "About how life surprises." "Sometimes, Ethan," he replied, smiling at the boy. "About how people come into our lives at just the right time, even when it seems like the wrong one." Ethan nodded, with the seriousness that still defined him, though he smiled more often. "Now, like how you came into ours, when you came to send us away from the house." Richard laughed at the boy's honesty. "Exactly. Sometimes what seems like an ending is just the beginning of something much better." The following Monday, as he signed the documents in his lawyer's office, Richard thought of Olivia. It was as if he could feel her presence, her silent support. "You'd approve of this, wouldn't you?" he thought. And for the first time in years, remembering her brought no pain, just a sweet longing and the certainty that she would be happy with his choices. "Everything is in order, Mr. Collins," the lawyer confirmed, organizing the papers. "Mr. Michael Stevens will need to sign his part, of course, but legally, the path is clear." Richard thanked him and stepped out into the sunny New York City day with a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. He drove to the hospital where Michael worked, waited patiently for his shift to end, and invited him for coffee. "You seem different today," Michael observed as they sat in a nearby cafe. "Did something happen?" Richard took a deep breath. "I need to ask you something important, Michael. It's about the kids." The nurse immediately tensed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Richard quickly reassured him. "Actually, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time." He paused, gathering courage. "I'd like your permission to start the process of jointly adopting Ethan and Lucy." Michael blinked several times, clearly surprised. "Joint adoption?" "Yes," Richard continued. "I'm not trying to replace you in any way. You'd still be their primary father, of course. But legally, I'd also be responsible, like a second father." Michael stayed silent for a long moment, processing the information. "Why, Richard?" he finally asked. Richard chose his words carefully. "Because I love those kids as if they were my own. Because I want to make sure that no matter what happens to me or to you, they'll always have security and stability. Because," he hesitated briefly, "because over the last 2 years, you've all become the family I'd given up on having." Michael took a sip of coffee, thoughtful. "You know this isn't something simple, right? Legally, emotionally." "I know," Richard agreed. "That's why I spent the last 6 months consulting specialized lawyers. It's possible, though uncommon. It's called multi-parenting. It would be recorded that they had 2 fathers and would continue to have Emily as their mother on their documents." Michael smiled slightly. "You really did your research." "It's far too important not to do it right," replied Richard. "But I'll only move forward if you're completely comfortable with the idea. And, of course, if the children agree too." The nurse gazed out the window, thoughtful. "Do you know what impresses me the most about all this, Richard? It's not the material generosity, the house, the children's education, all of that. It's the time. You're one of the busiest men I know, managing multi-million-dollar ventures, and yet you still find time to help with homework, to attend school performances, to simply be present." Richard smiled. "I've learned that time is the only resource that, once lost, can't be recovered, and there's no more valuable investment than the time we give to those we love." Michael reached out and clasped Richard's hand. "Let's talk to the children, together." The conversation happened that same evening after dinner in the house with the blue door. Richard and Michael explained, as simply as they could, what joint adoption would mean, that Richard would legally become their father too, as an extension of the family they'd already built. Ethan listened carefully, asking precise questions, whether his last name would change, if he'd have to call Richard Dad, if this meant he'd start living with them. Lucy, with the simplicity of her 7 years, had just one question. "Does this mean Uncle Richard will be part of our family forever, really and truly?" When Michael confirmed it, the little girl broke into a radiant smile and ran to hug Richard. "I always wanted you to be my dad too." Ethan, more reserved, approached afterward, and to everyone's surprise also embraced Richard. "Thank you for wanting to be our dad," he whispered. That night, after the children went to bed, Richard and Michael sat on the porch, as they had so many times over the years. The starry sky and gentle breeze created an air of serenity. "I never imagined my life would take this turn," Richard remarked, gazing at the city lights. "When Olivia passed, I thought I'd never have a family again. I buried myself. In work, in construction, in business. I built skyscrapers and tore others down as if I could fill the emptiness inside me with concrete and steel." Michael smiled. "And then you knocked on the wrong door. Or the right one, depending on your perspective," Richard corrected. "Those 2 children on the doorstep, so small, yet so strong. It was like something frozen inside me began to melt in that instant." The following months were dedicated to the legal process of joint adoption. There were interviews, psychological evaluations, visits from social workers. The fact that Richard was an influential businessman didn't make it easier. On the contrary, it required even more scrutiny to ensure his intentions were genuine. Finally, on a Thursday morning, the news came. The judge had approved the petition. Ethan and Lucy now officially had 2 fathers, Michael, who had raised them from birth, and Richard, who had entered their lives by chance and chosen to stay out of love. To celebrate, Richard organized a small gathering in the central square of Magnolia Gardens. Only their closest were invited: Mrs. Murphy, who remained a constant presence in the children's lives, Walter Fisher, who had become Richard's advisor and close friend, and a few neighbors who had followed their journey from the beginning. Under the afternoon sun, as the children ran happily across the lawn and the adults chatted warmly, Richard watched the scene with a sense of fulfillment he never thought he'd feel again. His gaze settled on the sunflowers that now grew abundantly throughout Magnolia Gardens, especially in the yard of the house with the blue door, silent symbols of the extraordinary journey they had traveled. Michael approached, handing him a glass of champagne. "What are you thinking about?" Richard smiled, accepting the drink. "About how lucky we are, all of us. About how life sometimes takes us down unexpected paths to show us what truly matters." "To new beginnings," Michael toasted. "To new beginnings," Richard agreed, looking at Ethan and Lucy, who were now running toward them, their faces glowing with sunlight and the joy of that special day. And there, in that perfect moment, Richard knew he had finally found what he had spent his whole life searching for: in ventures, in business, in the pursuit of wealth. A true home. Not a structure of concrete and bricks, but that sacred space created by love among people who choose every day to walk through life together. The end of the story. Dear listener, has this journey of Richard and his new family touched your heart? Share your own story of unexpected encounters that changed your life. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming tales.